Before we start, a word of warning. This isn't just another scary story. What you're about to hear is inspired by real American folklore, cursed places that still exist and that few dare to speak of. So kill the lights, turn up the sound, and let me take you to a place where darkness breathes more heavily than life itself. Cold Creek, a small town swallowed by endless forests and forgotten roads in Ohio, has always had a reputation no one spoke of aloud. Its inhabitants claimed there was something strange in the air, a haunting heaviness, as if the very ground held secrets too dark to ever see the light. At a glance, it looked like an ordinary town. Worn wooden houses, an old rusted iron bridge, and an abandoned school at the center, consumed by weeds. But those who lived there knew that by night, the town changed. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. Dogs would howl for no reason, and footsteps could always be heard on the streets even when no one was outside. The most repeated legend was that of the old canning factory, a massive ruin where dozens of workers died in a fire decades ago. The elders claimed that ever since, strange lights were seen in the windows, as if people were still working inside, but in silence, in the shadows, with faces that no longer belonged to this world. As night fell, Cold Creek was a place that seemed devoured by its own darkness. The wind howled through the empty houses and made the roof timbers creak as if the entire town were breathing. A group of teens, bored with their mundane lives, decided to break the one unwritten rule: never enter the factory after midnight. With nervous laughter, weak flashlights, and a show of false bravado, they slipped through the rusted gate and stepped inside. The first thing they noticed was the cold. It wasn't a normal chill. It was a bone-deep frost that bit their skin and made every breath feel heavy. The silence was absolute, broken only by the echo of their own steps. Dust rose in thick clouds, and the walls, scorched by the old fire, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. They went up to the second floor, their flashlights cutting through the endless halls. Suddenly, one of the lights began to flicker until it died. In the gloom, they swore they saw a motionless silhouette, too still, watching them from the back. But when they aimed all their flashlights there was nothing. One of them, the skeptic, tried to laugh it off, but his laughter was abruptly cut short. They all clearly heard a metallic sound, chains dragging on the floor, getting closer. The echo bounced throughout the building as if it were coming from every direction at once. The flashlights began to fail one after another. Darkness swallowed them almost completely, and in the middle of that void, they heard whispers, not clear voices, but murmurs that seemed to come from the very walls. Some said incomprehensible words. Others repeated their names. One of the boys, terrified, ran for the exit, but on the main staircase he swore he felt an icy hand clamp down on his ankle. He fell to the floor, and screaming, managed to crawl to the entrance gate. When the others reached him, they found him pale, trembling, with deep purple marks around his leg, as if he'd been held tightly. That night, they all ran, vowing never to return. But when they got home, they discovered something even worse. The finger marks kept appearing on their bodies, more and more, every morning, as if the hands that touched them in the factory had decided to follow them home. Cold Creek had collected a new debt, and in that town, no one escaped its darkness. The following days were a living torment for the boys who dared to enter the factory. At first, they thought they could just ignore it, convince themselves it was a bad trip fueled by fear. But Cold Creek doesn't forget, and what haunts its ruins doesn't either. The boy who had been dragged by that invisible hand started to decline. Every night, he'd wake up screaming, swearing someone was watching him from the corner of his room. His mother would find him shivering, his eyes bloodshot, his fingernails raw from clawing at the wall, desperate to escape something unseen. The others weren't faring any better. One confessed to hearing chains rattling in his own hallway, even though he lived alone. Another claimed that every time he looked in the mirror, a blackened figure would form behind his reflection, motionless, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. Cold Creek was slowly creeping into their lives. The paranoia pushed them to meet again, convinced they had to go back to the factory to break the curse. A desperate gamble, because they all knew that once the darkness chooses you, there's no turning back. That same night, armed with new flashlights, they headed for the old factory. A thick fog clung to the air, so dense it seemed to swallow the sound of their footsteps. The silence was unreal, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. Upon entering, everything had changed. It wasn't just a ruined building anymore. The walls seemed solid. The lights flickered as if the factory were still in full operation, and they could hear distant voices, muffled screams, and the clatter of phantom machinery. They had stepped into a different time, trapped in the very moment of the fire that had consumed those workers. In a corner, a figure emerged. A man covered in soot, his skin scorched, staring at them without moving. And behind him, dozens more bodies, all silent, all with their gazes fixed on the boys. The air filled with smoke. They coughed, struggling to breathe, but knew there was no real fire. It was a memory, the suffering of trapped souls, replaying over and over. Suddenly, one of the boys screamed. He was being dragged into the shadows, pulled directly toward the figures. In a mix of terror and desperation, the others tried to grab him, but it was no use. The last thing they saw were his hands scraping the floor, disappearing into the dark. They ran, but the exit seemed to get farther with every step. The entire building warped, hallways repeating themselves, as if Cold Creek had decided they, too, were meant to stay there forever. When they finally burst out, there were only 3. Panting, their clothes covered in ash, their eyes wild with terror. They looked back. The factory was silent, still, as if nothing had ever happened. No one ever spoke of what occurred. No one reported the disappearance. In Cold Creek, everyone knows that what the darkness takes never comes back. But since that night, the whole town changed. More dogs howled, more houses heard footsteps in the dead of night, and everyone swore they saw new shadows wandering the streets. Cold Creek had opened the door, and the darkness was no longer confined to the factory. It was out. Thank you for making it to the end of this story. If you listen to the whole thing, it means you're either brave, or the darkness of Cold Creek is already watching you. Remember, your support is what keeps these stories alive. Subscribe, comment, and share your opinion. I want to know what parts scared you the most. And never forget, give me all your fear.